It's a pleasure, Your Excellency, to host you today. Very much looking forward to your remarks and our discussion here. The ambassador has had a very distinguished career, within Europe. I noticed that you've set up the Innovation Council in Europe, so knows a little bit about innovation. We're going to talk a little bit about that in the discussion. And most importantly, you've been now in Japan since the autumn of 2022. So without further ado, I think you're going to give sort of a 10, 12 minutes overview of the deepening strategic partnership between Europe and Japan. And then we'll have a little chat, and then we open it up for discussion, with the audience. So, Your Excellency.
Yes, but that was fast. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for this invitation. It's a great opportunity for me to indeed share what is going on in this important relationship between Japan and the European Union. But maybe I should start by saying that I'm also very pleased to do it today at a moment where Kishida-san is in Washington. I saw my good friend Ram welcome him on the tarmac just yesterday, to say that we are indeed at a moment, and certainly when I arrived in September 2022, this was at play already, but intensified very significantly since, of a major shift in the way the world is set up and the way international actors interact with one another. I don't think I need to go into any substance in this group. This is, I think, really very well known. But in this context, what is at play is that whilst Japan, Europe, the US, many others are reaching out globally, we also are trying to find the best setup between like-minded partners. And as Kishida-san is in Washington, just a few days ago, we had in Leuven in Belgium the Trade and Technology Council between the United States and Europe. There's a particularly intense relationship, strategic relationship, trade relationship between the US and Europe. So that's a very strong segment of these like-minded partners. And then equally, you have this very strong segment, historic, maybe even deeper, between Japan and the US, and in fact between East Asia, Japan at the center, and the US. And what I think really is now at play is that these two segments form in reality a triangle with a deepening relation between the European Union, its 27 member states, and Japan and East Asia. And I think we really need to work on that partnership to have this more balanced, like-minded setup, allowing us to cooperate and work together across all policy areas, strategically, but also economically, technologically, dealing with major challenges in digital and in climate and environmental change. So that's really the vision, working on that triangle. So working obviously in my case and in the case of the embassy, the European Union delegation embassy here in Japan, on the lower part of the triangle, but having that broader context in mind. I think we have never been in such an intense relationship as we are today for all those reasons. What has happened in the last decade is that Europe and Japan, which have known each other forever, and have engaged with one another forever. I think we like each other, we admire each other, and we have this historical relationship. But I think what has now come to the fore in the last 10 years, now more intensely, is that not only do we like each other, but we also now know that we need each other. And that is really what happened at the end of the last decade, where the economic partnership agreement was in the end successfully negotiated and entered into force in 2019. This is the biggest trade agreement, entirely comprehensive, which the European Union has. We don't have trade agreements with everyone. We don't have one with the US, for example, and not yet with India, certainly not with China. There is a comprehensive trade agreement with Japan, allowing indeed actors on both sides to trade in services, to trade in goods. Agricultural products are very successful. And also, this is a framework for regulatory cooperation of a very intense nature. This trade agreement was in the making for years, 10, 15 years. I think what has happened is, of course, also that the CTTPP didn't happen. And then this pivot to the economic partnership agreement took place. So that's really the very basis of the framework for the relationship, including in terms of respective foreign direct investments. We are major partners for one another. On top of that, at the same time, we also put in place a strategic partnership agreement, which covers, in effect, all policy areas of interest to Japan and to the European Union. And this was then complemented by 3 specific partnerships, which are less institutional, but nevertheless very powerful. One, Green Alliance. Japan was the only country for a while which had a Green Alliance with the European Union. Now we have one also with Norway and Canada. We have a digital partnership. That's the most recent framework, which is particularly productive, I must say, but for obvious reasons. AI regulation is now happening in Europe and is a basis for a strong discussion with Japan. The massive investments here, which mirror the ones in Europe on chips, and the next generation of chips is also part of those discussions, as is obviously quantum computing, where Europe is leading, at least in science, and where Japan is investing heavily. High-performance computers have been traditionally interacting, and we are now working also on submarine cable connections to upgrade these capacities. So there's a lot happening on the digital side, and not to mention that we just completed our free trade agreement with an agreement on data flows, which was the missing part in 2019, has now been delivered a few months ago. So the digital partnership is really particularly productive. And I think it also makes sense with the concept here in Japan of data free flow with trust, very much mirrors, I think, the way Europe is looking at that as well. And we have also a third partnership, which is more challenging, but I find potentially extremely interesting, which is on a connectivity partnership, where we are trying, also in the broader context of the G7, to look at joint investment offers to partners. So, of course, you have always technical, financial specificities on both sides. So we are more looking at parallel implementation of projects, but this also, I think, has strong potential to help us engage with partners across the world. So I'm not speaking of the Global South, because I usually speak of the so-called Global South. And I think that's really a concept which doesn't work. But I think it's nevertheless an important momentum, and indeed reaching out jointly, Japan and Europe, would make a lot of sense. And we do it in East Asia, in Africa, and also increasingly in Latin America. So as you can see, the framework is in fact completely comprehensive, entirely in place. And now what is happening, and I think what has, of course, started it, is the pandemic, where we have seen the first cracks and pressures on supply chains. And we have seen Japan struggling, Europe struggling, notably on medicines during the pandemic. In terms of the vaccines, they were, of course, available first in Europe, also in the US. Maybe I should say here that most of you here in the room, if you were in Japan during the pandemic and you got 2 first shots in 2021, they came from Europe. Because the vaccine, unfortunately, and I apologize to the company, the unfortunately Pfizer called vaccine is in fact a European vaccine developed by a European company, BioNTech, in Germany, which then teamed up with Pfizer for the late clinical trials in the US and for production in the US. But the vaccine was developed in Europe. And then as we vaccinated across Europe in 21, we continue to export. In fact, for any single dose inoculated in Europe, one was exported to the world, and in large amounts here in Japan. Exports out of the US started only much later in 21, which is why I can confidently say that those vaccinated until October 21 were with European developed and produced vaccines. So that, I think, was, even if this was not so visible, a first illustration of that strategic relationship between Europe and Japan. Then obviously the war in Ukraine is a game changer. And so the way Japan handled it at the outset, but also during the G7, has also played a major role in intensifying the momentum of the relationship. And Kishida-san said it best, I think, when he went to the NATO summit in May in Madrid, saying that from Ukraine to the Indo-Pacific, Taiwan Strait, this is one security theater, and therefore from security, military, defense, but also economic security, the relationship between Japan and Europe is absolutely essential. And in fact, leaders decided last July to start discussions and negotiations now on a security and defense partnership, which is in discussion as we speak, and which we hope can be in place in the short term between us, and that will allow also to upgrade ongoing discussions in this key area. And then last is, of course, the deep pressure we are all under from China. Of course, in terms of proximity, Japan is in a different place than Europe. But in terms of economic exposure, I think the situation is in fact very similar, much more similar than we sometimes realize, and much more similar between Europe and Japan than between the US and Europe or the US and Japan. The exposure is much greater, which also means that we developed this concept, and this was done by Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the Commission, of de-risking, because we can't decouple. And that, I think, is really what carried also then the G7 last year and the Japanese chairmanship. And we are now really working across a great number of technologies and areas, not too close to China. We will continue to work with China. It's a major partner, competitor, and systemic rival, as we frame it in Europe. But there's really here need and space for Japan with Europe to work on specific supply chains, specific sectors, specific products, alternative materials in terms of supply chains, critical raw materials, joint investments, or at least joint monitoring of supplies to ensure that we can manage and mitigate dependencies and de-risk. Let me finish by saying that we have a real sense of that, what that means in Europe, not vis-à-vis China. Japan experienced it in 2010 with the Senkaku Islands. But we have, of course, the experience now of the Russian aggression on Ukraine and the end of Russian gas, essentially overnight. Overnight, it became unreliable and very fast unavailable. And this has been a major challenge and remains a major challenge for Europe's industry and society. But we have seen that this is possible. We also have seen that we need to be strategic about our dependencies. And there are, of course, key dependencies on China, notably on the climate and clean tech transition. But that's certainly a topic also for our discussion. So particularly important and an interesting time of that relationship, and one which can only further intensify with economic actors, I think, making really good use of the framework, and with the administrations trying to be relevant and helpful to facilitate that. Voilà.
Voilà.
Thank you.
Wow, this was, now we've got, everything that we can start on. Now, let me take it to the practical level and real level. Now, you've been in Japan since the autumn of 2022. When you arrived, right, and in your first sort of 6, 7, 8, 9 months, right, what were the things that surprised you the most on being here on the ground? Obviously, you're not a Japan expert.
Nope.
You've been very, very involved, in the key phase of Europe coming together, Europe having confidence to actually begin to write and shape global rules. Now you're in Japan. What's been your biggest surprise?
Well, I think my biggest surprise, even if I think I was frankly rather well prepared, not because I worked, but because I had the benefit of a very close friend of mine who unfortunately passed away as I left, Mauro Petriccione, who was the lead negotiator for the EPA, an admirer and lover of Japan, and I think he was also very well regarded here. He really prepared me for my posting, and was meant then also to join and be there when I started, which unfortunately could not take place. But he really prepared me very, very well. So let me not speak of surprise, but of challenge. I think what I see, and it's still at play today, is that we have two rather distinct cultures of moving policies forward and making decisions, which I think you really need to accept, understand, and work through, which is that politically, Europeans are quite keen, of course, to have a full grasp of the situation, analyze it, but then first make a decision of principle politically, and then work on the specifics of implementation. What I see mostly in our relationship with Japan, it's the other way around. You need really to have gone through all these steps of possible implementation before you take the decision of principle. And that is not so easy to reconcile, because you need to keep momentum also going. Japan and Europe, we are two very distinct setups, complex, both of them. I mean, Japan is very complex. Europe is not much easier to deal with, because it's 27 countries, several institutions, very many specific complex policy areas in the way we frame that at EU level. So I think there is a real need for actors to invest in that. And that takes not only effort, time, and resources in a team, but also you need to accept that this will be in the medium and longer term until you get to an outcome. And so my role is also to ensure that my team, my colleagues back in Brussels, have that patience. I think this is really what you learn probably in Asia, but certainly in Japan as well.
And what is your impression sort of from the Japanese side, in the sense of that you've got obviously the proximity in Asia, you've got obviously the importance of Asia, you've got, because of the increasing assertiveness of the People's Republic of China, the increasing economic might and power, and the density across all specters, because even quantum computing, I mean, it's not as though the Chinese are in the 19th century, right? They're certainly extremely competitive there. So is there a sense of prioritization from the Japanese, in the sense of that Europe has become a little bit less, not relevant or important, but just you have to make choices, right? So you're going to focus on the Pacific, you're going to focus obviously on the United States of America, as well as on Asia Pacific, while Europe's sort of a little bit two steps too removed. What is your perception there?
I think the challenge obviously exists, and it's on both sides. Japan is also far removed from Europe. I mean, that's my challenge, and my challenge, the challenge of all those which are working on the relationship with Japan, and particularly the team here in the embassy, to work on this lower part of this strategic triangle. You really need to indeed invest in explaining, showing the opportunities which exist, because in reality, I think the opportunities are immense between Japan and Europe. There is a degree of complementarity which is rather unique. Of course, we will economically and scientifically maybe as well, but economically particularly, we will compete essentially. And that's absolutely fine, obviously. That's also the DNA of what the European Union is about, what our internal market is about. A resilient supply chain is not necessarily one which you build together, it's one which exists and is available on a constant, trusted basis. So what Japan will develop and successfully develop, maybe in chips, in Lapidus, is a good development for Europe, because it creates a reliable, trustworthy supply chain. But at the same time, there are also many areas where I think cooperation would trump this direct competition. And the point is to indeed identify those areas. And I think Japan is, and many players in Japan, I think are increasingly identifying players in Europe to precisely do that. Again, this is not happening across the border. And I think the breadth and depth of the relationship between Japan and ASEAN will not be matched by the one between Japan and the European Union. Even if in strategic areas, I think the cooperation with Europe might be more important. I mean, in quantum, I mean, the best science in the world is not in China. At least we don't know if it's in China. And I don't think personally that it's in China. It's in Europe. I mean, the last Nobel Prizes in quantum were in Europe. That's science. Then in terms of translating this in machines, that's a different story, obviously. And the capacity of investment which our US partners have is of a different nature. But the science is in Europe. And the same goes for clean tech developments. The science, but here also the technology and the ongoing deployment is in Europe. So there are many areas, and I think this is increasingly identified, and I think we need to make it very visible, where there is a real sense of really creating more of these corporations, and in many cases, trilateral or multilateral corporations as well.
Yeah, it's very interesting that you said, sort of at the outset, sort of Europe leads by the big ideas. Europe leads by principles, while the Japanese are pragmatic and say, let's see how we get from A to B before we think about, the whole.
I'm not sure I said it exactly like this, but it's a nice way of putting it.
It's a German interpretation. No, but so the question is, in your personal opinion, right?
Yeah.
What are the 3 or 4 ideas where Europe leads right now? Because it's very clear, that, I mean, in simplistic terms, right? The idea of Europe of developing, a system that transcends the original national state. At the heart of which, of course, the German-French relationship, the steel-coal agreements, and then leading to Europe. I mean, this was something new we had never seen in history. Now, obviously, that's being challenged, by the war in the Ukraine. So, what are the areas you think where Europe is leading?
Well, I think I mean, the first point remains more relevant than ever. On the contrary, I think the Russian aggression on Ukraine has made the European Union as a project more important than ever. Not just for Europeans, but certainly also for the European Union. And this argument that the reality of your national sovereignty in Europe, in any case, takes place also in the context of this emerging European sovereignty is more and more straightforward and obvious and also politically accepted. No one is pushing back right now, at least, on membership of the European Union. I mean, Brexit has been a lesson from that point of view, and many players across Europe have seen how complex and politically costly it is to leave the European Union. I mean, there are many other factors that play in the United Kingdom, of course, which have made it particularly difficult, but nevertheless. And even those which in Europe are partners which are challenging some of EU policies, they don't challenge their own membership. So I think, on the contrary, there's now really a sense that the European Union is a critical construct. At the heart of it, it was a construct for peace, and we got the Nobel Prize back in 2012 for that. As a political organization. Today, it remains, I think so, and in particular on this notion of the international rules-based order, as we say here in Japan, the way the Europeans are supporting, as long as it takes, Ukraine in this war against Russia remains really at the heart of this construction. So I think from that point of view, in terms of governance and policy building, the uniqueness of the European Union, I think, remains a benchmark, if not an inspiration, for many other regional efforts to construct more relevant relations. I mean, I myself, I have a German mother. I don't know if you know that. I have a German mother and a French father.
All do.
And a French father. And so I was born in 66. So the Élysée Treaty between France and Germany is 62. So I'm a child of the Élysée Treaty, if you want, and really a child of this European reconciliation and the construct of a continent where war is not possible. Disagreements happen all the time, but they are solved within this institutional setup. I'd be very happy also to cover some of the way this works, because I think it's particularly interesting. But let's see if that is of interest today. The second area where we lead, I think, is obviously on climate change. I mean, this doesn't need to be explained. We are the only ones who really lead. We've been on it now for 30 years. We've created a framework in the 90s and the last 25 years, and not just in climate policy, but also across all sectors, or not all of them yet, but nearly all sectors relevant for that climate transition. We have now frameworks in place. We have instruments, we have the Innovation Fund, we are creating a hydrogen bank, we have hard legislation on climate abatement, 55% by 2030. We are phasing out the thermal engine. I mean, we have really put in place a framework which is, of course, extremely challenging on our societies and on our industries, but which is one which is really giving absolutely clear direction to investors for 2030, in fact, until 2050, because what you do until 2030 in terms of deep changes across carbon-intensive industries, across the energy system or the transport system, will then, by itself, to an extent, lead towards climate neutrality. So this is really already at play. And we are industrially a clean tech leader, much challenged, certainly on the solar side. The market is entirely dominated by China, but on other parts of the clean tech, we are very much there. And yes, of course, the US is now catching up massively, and that's great to have also the US investing so much in that industrial and energy transformation. And Japan is now getting into it also. But in terms of leadership, I think there is no doubt that the European Union is there leading politically, but also in terms of deployment. So these are certainly two areas. I would also add, even if you will certainly challenge me on that, Jesper, is that I think we also lead on science. I used to run the science policy of the European Union, so of course I'm slightly biased. But I still think that the best science is taking place in Europe. Of course, not only in Europe. I mean, there's reasonably good science in the US. And there certainly is quite good science here in Japan too. But I think we are completely missing the fact that in Europe we have the best engineering culture, or with Japan.
In Germany.
Including in Germany. We have universities which generate extraordinarily talented young people. We are an extremely attractive continent, so we also attract talent from across the world. And we have in the last 20 years created a number of structures at very local level or at European Union level. We created the European Research Council. Don't know if it's probably not known in this group, but the European Research Council is inspired by the NSF, by the US NSF. Is the US NSF just better in the sense that it's more money, longer term, peer-reviewed, and blue sky research. And with that, we now see that every year we have 2, 3, 4 Nobel Prizes, European ones, where the research was funded at the outset by the European Research Council. It's just starting now because there's a lag time, obviously, between the research and the Nobel Prize. And this has now been a massive, massive investment in the last 15 years, which will continue to produce amazing science in Europe. Again, science which is open to partnerships and to the world, but amazing science. We are now trying to catch up on innovation. So now let me take your cue of early on. Across Europe, every major university, every big region, all member states have invested massively in innovation. So we are creating every year more startups than the US. No one knows that. We are a big continent, obviously, so per capita it's slightly less, but in absolute numbers, more startups than the US. Yes, they don't grow as fast. They fail as much, but they don't grow as fast, but they are there. And with that, we have now also a scale-up strategy, including with the European Innovation Council, which aims at being the equivalent of the European Research Council, which is our Nobel Prize factory. The European Innovation Council will be our unicorn factory. And it's progressively starting. So it's not just done bureaucratically top-down. There's much more at play. If you want, in Europe, we don't have Silicon Valley. Everybody knows that. But we have the equivalent in Helsinki, in Berlin, in Paris, across the European Union, and they are networked. And you have now come to a point in Europe where you have that critical mass of engineering, science, innovators, also investment funds, including massive Asian and European investments, which create the critical mass in these networked valleys across Europe. So there's a lot happening there as well.
Yeah. It's very interesting because, sort of at the very practical level, the European Research Council is incredibly innovative in the sense that, big money grants, right, are given to individual professors who then open this up to universities, and the universities compete in saying, well, if you come to us, we will provide X, Y, Z. If you come to us, you provide X, Y, Z, which is actually something that is not dirigiste, right? It's not top down, but it actually fosters competition amongst the research institutions. And that would be something that, Japan could benefit from a lot, right? If you gave it the grant to a professor and then the professor gets bids from different universities to set up his or her lab, right, in those universities. So it's an interesting it's really quite innovative. I want to switch tacks on something. You said, you know, you read the media, there's all this revival of the national state. You know, there's the German AfD, you know, the right-wing party coming through. You know, you've got, you know, she's still there, Marie Le Pen. You know, France, you've got Italy. I mean, this unease, you know, amongst the populace, right, to be run, you know, by Europe. Somewhat anonymous, right? It's not clear how the election process actually works. Voter participations are incredibly low for European elections. But just, you know, this feeling of the revival of the nation state, this revival of nationalism, what's your personal response to that?
Well, I'm just an ambassador. I'm not a politician, so I need to be a bit careful now in how I reply. I mean, just to say that in terms of participation to the European Parliament elections, in fact, the figures are not bad at all. Huh? They are in the high 60s. Huh? And last time in 19, for the first time, they went up again. Partly, I think, a broad mobilization around climate at the time, the Greta Thunberg miracle, as they used to call it in 2019. So they are not that bad. And don't get me started on democratic legitimacy of policy making at EU level, because I think it's particularly democratic. The fact is that it's indeed not known. But if you look at the mechanism of how, notably the European government, the European Commission comes into function, there is no system in Europe which is as democratic as this one. No? I mean, the president of the Commission is appointed by the leaders. So we have 27 heads of states and government which appoint the president of the Commission. I mean, and these 27 leaders, if they don't have democratic legitimacy, who has? Huh? That's the starting point. Then this person needs to go to the European Parliament, elected democratically and directly by the people, and she needs an absolute majority to get going. Then she is in discussion with member states to appoint her government, if you want, and each of these commission members go back to the parliament and they are grilled in the parliament on their intentions. And every time, 4 or 5 fail. So that's quite a process. And then the entire college goes back to the parliament and is voted as a group. So, I mean, this is quite solid stuff. Huh? And then when they do policies, when the European Commission does policies, we work with all actors across the economy, society, civil society. We consult very broadly. And then the legislation is discussed by 27 ministers, again with full national legitimacy, is discussed by parliament, and then the two negotiate the legislation. So, I mean, it can't get more democratic, but it's not direct democracy. And you're right, it's quite remote, and there's a degree of complexity, therefore, which is challenging. But back to your question, I don't think we have a revival of nationalism per se. I think there is a real issue across all policy areas, policy entities, not just in Europe, in terms of identity politics, in terms of populism, in terms of indeed growing social frustrations, maybe indeed economic and personal situations which are really challenging. And that translates indeed, not just in Europe, in very visible attention for these parties. As I said earlier on, as far as, I mean, with a few exceptions, but they are irrelevant in policy making at EU level. Huh? But in most cases, they don't say our country should not be part of the European Union. They all accept that the European Union is necessary, but they have a different take on a number of policies. And I'm not going to go through these policies because that's a bit complex and also politically quite sensitive. But that's really what is at play. I don't think that this is a revival necessary of nationalism, more of populism. And it's, of course, a challenging moment because whilst they don't put into question their membership, their appetite for collective solutions is probably indeed less than those of more European-minded, traditional European-minded parties. Let's see what the outcome of the EU election is in a few weeks. I mean, the trajectory seen from today still indicates that there will be a large majority in the European Parliament with a European agenda. So yes, there will be much more pressure from parts of the European Parliament for a narrow agenda, but I think the broad basis remains there. I think the challenge is indeed also in the European Council, because the European Council works by unanimity, in contrast to ministers which work by qualified majority. And this is where indeed all these tensions are so visible. But that's also the point. The European Council, when leaders meet, this is where the headlines are made. This is what is seen by all of us. And this is, of course, where disagreements are expressed, because they come to meet and sort them out. So what is highly visible is a disagreement. What is sometimes slightly less visible is the solution. And there is always a solution, not necessarily at the outset. We've seen it on Ukraine membership, on the massive financial support package of Europe. This was delivered. So I think this is also the way this needs to be put a bit into perspective, I would say.
Right. Changing tack again. How do we deal with America? It's very clear that America has become, very transactional in its foreign policy. America has become much more self-centered in its economic and foreign policy, as well as, of course, in its military and defense policies. You mentioned digital, right? Where Europe, is very progressive in setting standards. Europe is not afraid to sue Microsoft for $1 billion. But you're regulating something that you didn't invent. You're regulating something. It's the same problem that Japan has, right? Because all the innovation and particularly the commercialization, happens, in the United States, in the digital space, and to some extent, probably in the future, more from the People's Republic of China. So how do you put that into context, right? How do you deal with the US?
Well, I mean, we are working hand in hand with the US on a daily basis. As I said, we just had the Trade and Technology Council meeting. This happens as often as needed, but several times a year. And here again, obviously, on trade matters, this is a complicated relationship. But I think not just for us, for Japan as well. But it's a relationship indeed, which is rather transactional. This is not the way we Europeans see the global trade order. We are, of course, particularly attached to the WTO and also to its trade dispute resolution mechanism. So we have right now put in place a parallel system, which Japan has joined last year. So this was a major development also. And with Japan, we are, of course, very much seeing the WTO set up in a similar manner. It's different with the US, that's very clear. But this is something on which we need to work. The US is a key partner of Europe economically. Yes, the Inflation Reduction Act has very strong, how shall I put it, investment strategies which are inward centered.
It's called protectionism.
Voila. And well, it's technically a little bit different from it, but nevertheless, and like Japan, we've been working with the US to mitigate that and reasonably successfully, not perfectly. But at the same time, it's also true that in Europe, we are massively investing as well. And the real issue, I think, here is not so much the initial decision of the Inflation Reduction Act, is more that this has now triggered a subsidy race, which in part we are trying to match in Europe. And reasonably effectively in keeping companies in Europe. You always will see the headlines of those which have decided to also invest in the US. I think this is a challenge, notably in terms of economic anchoring in Europe, employment coming with it, obviously, not necessarily completely in terms of supply chains, but we are now also seeing in member states a capacity to support companies in their investments, notably on clean tech, keeping it then also in the European Union, including because markets are still very much happening also in the European Union. So that's also a strong basis. So that subsidies competition is a real issue, I think, and also a discussion which we are having with Japan to align and have, I think, a basis also to then dialogue better, including with the US. But your question then was also on the digital side. And I think on the regulatory side, I think this is certainly a policy point which is for Europe particularly important to get right. We are always identified as the how do you say this? Do you say party pooper in English, I think, on innovation,
Technical term, very technical term.
And we are indeed regulating tech more than anyone else, including obviously because that's expected in our societies. I mean, case by case, and if you want to become super analytically, you can then try to see whether we get it right or wrong. I think broadly, this is what is expected as a public service from European Union institutions. So I think there's nothing to apologize about. I think this is what our societies expect. And I think it's also, to be fair, very, very needed, in particular in digital services. But at the same time, it's also true that with that, we are sometimes in a difficult relationship with the US, and we are sometimes perceived as pushing out of Europe some innovation. I don't think I have seen that this innovation is pushed out of Europe. I think the issue of these massively successful companies not being in Europe is not just European regulation. There's much more than that at play. The language issue, the international scope, the financial capacity at the outset, the appetite for that type of innovation, all that explains it to a large extent, and not just the regulation. But I think it's so nevertheless really, really expected and necessary, and I think more than ever. Now, what is also to be considered is that we are a major market for everyone in the world, and therefore our standard setting power is very real, the famous Brussels effect. But I think we need to be a bit careful with that argument. We should not overstate it, and certainly not overplay it either, because on the one hand, our market relative size is shrinking demographically, economically. So I think the impact, the effect, I think in itself is mechanically eroded on the one hand. And secondly, I think we also need to be very careful in looking case by case what this impact is on economies and on partners around the world. So here, not so much the US, this is much more companies discussion. But I think when I look at our rules on deforestation, our rules on carbon border adjustment mechanism, which we have now which we're now putting in place. There's a good dialogue taking place with partners, including here in Japan, and this legislation is good legislation. Here again, I don't think we are apologetic about it, but I think we also need to reflect and see how this really impacts partners, and maybe then engage into a relationship, maybe helping investments in partner countries to help them deal with the impact of that legislation. So that's also part of the broader discussion, very much at play right now in the European Union.
Let me open up the floor. Any questions? Dozo.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Paquet, for your very interesting description of the common agenda we face today. And I welcome the growing strengthening of the tripartite cooperation between Japan, EU, and the US. But what worries me is the possible erosion of our ideas of liberal democracy because of the division of society in America and growing criticisms toward us from what is called Global South about the double standard. What we do in Russia, I mean, against Russia, and why we do it against Israel. How serious do you think it is, and what can we do?
Yeah. Yes, I think the relationship between the Europeans and the G7, let's say the G7, to be simple, and the rest of the world is one which has never been simple in reality. I don't think this is completely new. What is true is that the value-based EU external policy, because this is what this is, we are really basing our external policy on our values at EU level. I mean, member states do it as well, but member states, Germany, France, Estonia, Bulgaria, they also have economic hard interests which are in display in their relationship with all partners, is indeed today much more difficult as a central point of that relationship. Not so much because of the double standards. I think the double standards discussion is one which I think we need to push back on because, and in particular as Europeans, of course, the way the European Union at the outset has collectively handled the conflict in the Middle East has been cumbersome, let me use that word, and for obvious reasons, because this is the most complex, I think it's the most complex conflict in the last 30, 50 years. And it will remain a particularly complex conflict. And I think we need to engage to help both sides work a solution along the two states solution, which has been available, has not been picked up. Today it looks like near impossible to pick up, but I think we need to work on it. And at the outset, the Europeans were not entirely aligned. I think it's different now. There's now a real effort of Europe, with many others, including in the UN, to help, of course, on the humanitarian situation, which is so dire, but also then push both sides, or prepare rather the ground for both sides at some point to engage with one another and around, again, the two-state solution. So yes, I think this is a complicated moment, and the contrast indeed with the war in Ukraine is made by many. But beyond that, criticism, I think it's true that we need a different relationship with partners across the world. I think 2 or 3 years ago, I personally, and I think it's politically probably the case as well, but let me speak just now for myself in terms of my own policy analysis. I think we were indeed pushed quite hard by China on this notion of a new, different plurilateral world order. And China was really strong. And the early stages of the pandemic and the early seeming success in China on the pandemic certainly played a role in that. But then there was also this very assertive China around the Silk Road and many other developments. I think we are today in a slightly different place. And I think it's very visible then when we speak to partners across the world. In fact, they have agency. They're not so much, it's not China is the agenda for them or the West is in the agenda. They have their own agenda. And I think we are increasingly good at engaging with that. And I think better than others at engaging with that. So that's also, I think, part of the reply on work between Europe, Japan, and the Global South. I would make the case that there's a strong argument for Japan and Europe, not across the board, but in many cases to work together and maybe extend the joint offer. Again, not a joint offer across the board, but on critical raw materials, on investment in clean tech, maybe also politically. I think we should try more than we've been able to. It's very difficult to do because it requires a new way of thinking about diplomacy. So that's quite disruptive in reality, analytically, but also politically. So it will not happen fast and it will not happen across the board. But I think it should happen. I think we have complementarities. In Asia, you are very strong, but the Europeans also have a relevant role. And I think we can team up. We are doing it, for example, in Vietnam on the energy transformation. In Africa, we, of course, have a lot of history in Africa, not all member states, but many member states. And this is certainly a real challenge. Japan has no history in Africa. You are seen as a very positive partner. But on the other hand, you find it super complicated to do business in Africa. It's a challenging environment, in governance also, and therefore teaming up could make a big impact. So I hope that we will be able to do more of that as we move forward. But then on liberal democracies being put into question, yes, I mean, if you look at the politics of individual countries, so you mentioned the US, I'm not going to comment. It's indeed, there are real reasons to be worried about the cohesiveness of our societies. I mean, this is a worry I completely share. In my own, as a citizen, also in my own countries, I see that at play. So this is really, I think, an issue which needs to be dealt with by bringing citizens much more into the policy equation. I think doing policy at institutional level is not going to work anymore. You of course need institutional leadership, and there are democratic institutions which need to take responsibility. But I think if we are not smarter in then designing policies with a larger group and with those which are effectively interested in, we are going to see this erosion possibly go further. I'm not pleading for a Swiss model of direct democracy, but for a much more straightforward model where maybe at cities level, a city administration develops its transformation with all the actors in the city. This, I think, will create a lot in bringing back legitimacy to public policy making. So that's a real challenge for our societies, which I share with you. But then I think personally that when you look at the pandemic in the end, I think liberal democracies did really well. In fact, they did much better. So I don't think that we are a thing of the past. On the contrary, I think we are still a model allowing a society to grow in a more cohesive way. But we need to get some of the fundamentals right, that's for sure.
The point you're making about civil society, right? So
even citizens, more than civil society. Yeah.
You know, but sort of in terms of fostering interaction there, can you mention one or two projects that you're working on to foster greater civil society interaction between Europe and Japan?
Between Europe and Japan?
Or in general?
Yeah, in Europe there are many examples which we are indeed discussing with Japan. So maybe I can take indeed here one, which is on climate. When was that? In 2021, I think. We launched in Europe. It's a bit of a byproduct of the Covenant of Mayors on Climate, which is a really important setup. And in Europe, we added to that what we call a European mission, so goal-oriented, a European mission. And we asked European cities, do you want to be part of an agreement with us that you become climate neutral by 2030? 2030. And we had more than 350 cities which came forward to say, yes, we want to be part of that effort. We selected 100. And with those 100 cities, we are now working on their transformation plan, providing best practices across them, providing technology results to deploy them, but also providing platforms for those countries for those cities, to prepare their transformation, which is waste, energy, transport, production, food, to organize this transformation with citizens. So not just civil society, citizens. And that's really an extremely interesting experiment, which is at scale across Europe. The outcome will be diverse. These 100 cities will not all get there. I mean, you have Paris there, you have Lisbon, you have, I think Stuttgart is there, for example, Mannheim is there. So you have big cities, medium cities, you also have a few smaller ones. But the experiment in itself is absolutely spectacular. And there is a massive engagement from citizens in that transformation effort. So this is being discussed here in Japan with the 21 big cities. It's made available. I don't know how much it will be taken up, but this is really typically one area which cannot be done without us. Because technology will not get us to climate change. I know this is a little bit the idea here in Japan, but I mean, I've been in climate science very deeply for my sins, but it's also because it's needed. Technology will get us 60, 70% there. The rest is to be done by us. We need to change as individuals and as society. Not necessarily a full degrowth perspective, but we need to change. There's just no way around it. And this is where it's so important in order to be at local level to do it in this inclusive manner. So that's one example.
Ambassador, thank you. My name is Takeido from Sophia University. My question is about innovation and research.
Yep.
You established a European Innovation Council and promoted research innovation via policies. We are less likely to focus on social science research. If you have some mind between Japan and East Asia and European countries, what kind of social science subject or humanities subject could be promote innovation from your perspective? Thank you.
And now I probably would need to think a bit harder than what I will tell you now, because it's a really good question. I mean, in terms of social sciences, what is happening already now, as you know, is of course a lot of work on security, on geopolitics, on economic analysis, which is taking place. I mean, you have this amazing expertise, obviously, on the region here. We have expertise on other parts of the world, and this is increasingly being shared. That's what's happening, I think, broadly today. But let me broaden my reply to another point, which is that at European Union level, also sometimes in national research system, but at EU level, We have a program which is called Horizon Europe, which is a big research program, 100 billion euros over 7 years. And where the bulk of it, which funds the European Research Council, but where the bulk of it is on collaborative research. So we create consortia across member states. We have 8 universities which team up, and research organizations which team up around one specific topic in digital, in health, in energy, in agriculture. And the way we draft and this is, so the topics are drafted and then consortia establish themselves and compete for funding. The way we do that is that nearly all of these topics are cross-cutting. And nearly all of these topics, or let's say majority of these topics, are described in such a way that, of course, the tech side is part of the research and is often the main deliverable. But in all cases, we also ensure that there is a social science dimension in the project. Because again, tech in itself is great. But if tech does not take into account how it will be received by society, if tech doesn't take into account how it interacts with human beings, the impact is going to be suboptimal, to say the least. So that's also how we put social sciences into our scientific or research equation in Europe. And that's certainly, I'm not sure this is happening at the same scale in Japan or elsewhere. I don't have knowledge of that. But I think that's a model which I think could also be interesting in discussions with Japan. Can I say here, Jesper, that of course I'm still waiting for Japan to join Horizon Europe.
There you go.
So Horizon Europe is this program which is the 27 European Union member states, but we have for a very long time associated key countries to the program. We always had our neighbors associated to the program. Norway has always been there. Switzerland was mostly there. They're now coming back. The UK is now part of Horizon Europe after Brexit. That's a recent development. And when we prepared the last installment of that program, now called Horizon Europe, we decided that it would make sense to open this possibility to like-minded partners. Because research, I think, of course, takes place globally. Open science is so important. But there will then be these key areas of research and then more applied research where, frankly, you want to do it with like-minded partners, not necessarily just across the board. And this is why we opened the possibility to like-minded partners. And we now have New Zealand, Canada, which have joined the program, and Korea, which has just completed the negotiations to join the program. So that's already very good. And we are in discussions with Japan for that. So if Japan was part of the program, it would then be part also of that collaboration consortia building effort, and maybe with that also be part of this discussion on how you connect hard sciences, technology, research with social sciences.
Yeah, on that, obviously, the Okinawa Institute for Science and Technology would be the ideal.
I was there last week. I was impressed.
You were impressed?
Yes.
This is very good.
I was impressed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. I have a question. You've always talked about like-minded countries.
Yeah.
What is Plan B for the EU if next year Donald Trump is back, withdraws from NATO, which is, it's not an impossible threat. I mean, sometimes people do what they promise. Of course, stops aid to Ukraine and says, look, we're not your enemy, but you're on your own. What's the plan for a world without the United States as the major ally of Europe?
Yeah. I think you need to ask President von der Leyen and maybe the leaders of the European Council to give you a reply to that. I think that's a scenario which, in these radical terms you're describing, is really an extreme scenario. I think Europe will continue to have deep ties with the US, whatever the presidential administration is. And whatever the agenda then is implemented, these ties will continue. They are historical, they are people-related, and they are deeply economic. There is a massive European foreign direct investment in the US, and conversely, and actors on both sides of the Atlantic will continue to work together. So I think that's the first part of a policy analysis on this challenge. A second one is that yes, we are indeed gearing up to, and we're demonstrating it, to upgrade our capacity to support Ukraine, to also upgrade, because it already exists, a European defense policy and defense industry. This has started 2 decades ago, was very slow. We intensified this very much, including after Brexit. The UK was very reluctant. Therefore, there was more space to work on this after Brexit. And of course, with the war in Ukraine, we are member states individually, but also the European Peace Facility. It has been a major instrument to channel ammunition and weapons to Ukraine. Obviously, our defense industry is not where it needs to be in the intensity of that of the war happening in Ukraine, and it has been well identified. And if the scenario which you described was to materialize, this could only accelerate these developments. And then thirdly, Europe has many partners across Europe, around Europe, in Africa, and then Japan is really a key like-minded partner, and this will not change and could possibly then intensify.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Paquet. That was a fascinating conversation. I'm Nachi Das. I'm a recovering American banker. So in this multilateral world, I'd like your comments on 2 aspects. One is in the increasing importance of the Indo-Pacific arena, where Japan is making critical strides in the open seas or supply chain, as you talked about. Do you see EU playing a more proactive role, especially as America has been withdrawing, at least at a national level? Mm-hmm. And the second dimension is related to that, which is as this region becomes a thriving area of innovation, yes, and growing young populations, and both Japan and science and EU have amazing science, but not that many innovative global enterprises. Do you see a role for EU in fostering innovation in a practical sense in this region?
Yeah. Yes, I think the Indo-Pacific, I mean, of course, now I have an issue of perspective. I'm sitting in the Indo-Pacific, so of course I now find it super important. So I need to be a bit careful to assess it. But if I look indeed at the attention on the summit, if I look at the Indo-Pacific Ministerial Forum, which took place just now a few months ago in Brussels, after it was launched as a forum by Sweden, picked up by France, now it was in Brussels, and indeed, leadership in Europe was present. I think the Indo-Pacific is obviously absolutely identified as the critical part of the world where Europe needs to become more relevant, more present, and where we need to create more partnerships. So I hope I illustrated it in some aspects now with Japan, but the same goes certainly for India, where we hope and where we are working. We now have a Trade and Technology Council with India, for example. We are considering and discussing a possible trade agreement with India. So we are investing in that relationship a lot, and India is also interested. And India, as I think, is a great example of a country which finds smart and relevant and mutually interesting relationship with many partners. So that is certainly happening. In terms of, because you spoke of maritime security, in terms of security, I think here also, as the war in Ukraine is a major challenge for the security of the region and of Japan, the other way around is absolutely true as well. And freedom of navigation on the seas is a critical dimension, of course, for Europe's trade and external policy. And this is why we have the Aspides mission right now in the context of the Houthi aggression war on the sea. So we have now a military mission there, and you see more and more naval and also airborne assets from European armies in the region. You had French ships, German ships, Italian ships. You will have more ships next year doing port calls in Japan, and very much then traveling in the region as a visible presence. So that, I think, will only increase in this broader geopolitical context. Now, on innovation, there's this pitch which I like to make sometimes on innovation, because if you speak of big companies. So yes, I said it before, we are not yet particularly good at scaling up fast. That's not the way innovation works in Europe. And therefore, there's a real challenge to lose innovators which go to the US or sometimes elsewhere, but mostly to the US, because they believe that indeed, notably, capital markets are more attuned to innovation and risk-taking, which is in part correct. In part only because the major US investment funds, in fact, are in Europe and interested to invest in Europe. And in fact, talent is also largely either staying or coming back to Europe. Because it's very nice to be successful in Silicon Valley, but the quality of life in Helsinki or in Lisbon is probably quite nice. So, but okay, that's a question of taste and personal taste. But I'm saying this from experience. I see great engineers coming from all of Europe, which have grown in California and are now coming back in Europe when they are turning 40, have a family. They then bring their innovation also back to Europe. But still, it remains a challenge. I think one reason is also that in the US, innovation is really meant to work faster. That's how it's designed. This notion that you burn money. I mean, you've heard that before, no? I'm always shocked when I meet innovators. I traveled to Silicon Valley at the time, and the concept was I burn money to be fast. And as I say, in Europe, we don't burn money, we create value. And in the sense that really these innovators, they are there and mostly in areas which is value innovation or impact innovation on climate, on energy, on health, on biotechnology. This is where the innovation takes place in Europe. Indeed, less on digital. Of course, you also have digital successes. Skype is a European success, for example. But they are much more focused on these areas where, which is labeled sometimes deep tech. And this is where we are strong. And I think where we will be very strong also moving forward, because this combines engineering, it combines science, and it combines innovation. And on the two first ones, I mean, don't look further than Europe. We are really good. And if you manage to combine it properly with innovation, and that's where the Innovation Council comes in, the notion of the European Innovation Council is quite unique. Again, inspired by DARPA, as a matter of fact, but with a few twists which make it really interesting. The European Innovation Council is a setup where innovators come. We have thousands of projects every year. We select between 1% and 3%. So not very different from venture capital in terms of amounts. So we are super selective because there's so much interest. We do that by drawing on also the evaluation capacity we have from the rest of our research program. So we have real scientists which are evaluating. And that's really one of the challenges for deep tech, that venture capital is not very comfortable with it, because you still have you're still usually at the stage where as you scale up, there still is quite some research and science to be validated, and it's disruptive in many cases. So we bring that in, and then we provide substantial grant funding, 5 million up to 10, but at the same time we take equity. The European Innovation Council takes equity and then aims at helping the company in round B and sometimes round C. So that's the way the European Innovation Council works. So quite interesting also, not easy, and we will fail. As I used to say as Director General, this is public money. So I'm not supposed to tell you that the measure of my success will be our failures, which is the DARPA pitch, which I like a lot. But still, this is also what is accepted now. And I hope we will fail, because that will also mean that there will be more and more of these companies. I mean, you have today, under the European Innovation Council, you have around 4 billion of equity value already, and you have 3 or 4 unicorns, from what I was told, and about 20 what they call centurions, so 100 million plus. So it's starting. Let's see how far we get. But again, in terms of talent, because one of the main issues I think in Japan, in Europe, and in the US, everywhere is attracting the best talent. I mean, training talent, so getting people into STEM, into university, retaining them, but also attracting talent. And I think Europe is a value proposition from that point of view.
Your Excellency, fantastic. Thank you so much for a grand horizon. We touched on many dimensionalities. Yes, I hope you all get some food for thought. Certainly on the innovation side, Japan has, a lot that could be acquired and learned from the progress, particularly over the last 10 years, that Europe has made. Also in terms of standing up for multilateralism, standing up for a rules-based society, standing up for a society where the government plays a role. While sometimes, in the US, well, the government, certainly at one extreme, shouldn't play any role, right? So I think from that perspective, the complementarity between Japan and Europe is something that will continue to yield, hopefully, some positive surprises. Your Excellency, thank you very much.